Hello Steelers, and welcome to this video in which I'm going to show you how I painted and weathered these Warlord Games 28mm scale T34 76 tanks. These tanks can be bought as part of the Achtung Panzer Soviet starter set, but they're also available as individual kits as well. You can find an affiliate link in the description down below if you want to buy either of these from Warlord Games. I'm going to be painting this model without the use of an airbrush, and I'm going to be using materials that are also easily available and very cheap. I'll put a list of everything that I use in the video description down below. But first, let's talk about the T34 tank. Arguably, the T34 is the most iconic tank of the Soviet Army of the Second World War. It was first developed by Mikhail Koshkin after the Battle of Khalkhin Gol demonstrated the shortcomings of the outdated tank designs that the Soviet Army were currently using. Koshkin had formulated an idea for a heavier main battle tank since 1934, which gave rise to the designation T34. Koshkin's design was based on the American Christie tank, which had sprung suspension and sloped armour. By the time of the German invasion of 1941, the T34 Model 1941 was already in use, and it surprised the German tank crews that came up against it, as it outclassed the majority of the German armour at the time. However, by 1942 the T34 was thought to be underpowered by the Soviet authorities, but production continued as it would have been more difficult to switch during a wartime economy. By 1943, an average of 1,300 T34s were being produced a month. This was the equivalent to 3 full-strength tank divisions. As Joseph Stalin is reported to have said, quantity has a quality of its own. The main gun on the earlier models of the T34 was a 76.2mm gun, which by the middle of the war was unable to compete with the upgraded German tanks such as the Panthers and Tigers. So an upgraded T34 appeared with an 85mm gun mounted on a specially designed turret. This meant that existing chassis could still be used, allowing for a smoother production chain. This final model of the T34 was by far the most numerous produced, and it was still in service across the world long after the Second World War had finished. The T34 was the second most produced tank in the world, after the T55, another Soviet tank, and it is said that over 84,000 T34s were eventually built. In this video, I'm going to build a T34 Model 1943. This was the final model that housed a 76.2mm gun, and it was also nicknamed the Mickey Mouse by the German tank crews due to the distinctive double circular crew hatches. The design of the T34 was pretty basic, and this is replicated in this Warlord kit with very few parts for the model. I added the large square stowage bins to the rear as I like the look of them, and they also add a distinctive silhouette to the tank itself. The turret was an easy build, and the pieces went together very well, and they were secured in place using polystyrene cement. To finish off the hull and the turret, I added some third-party stowage which I bought on eBay. This is resin cast, and there are numerous manufacturers making different sets. I will put a link to this one in the description down below. It adds interest to the model, and in service tanks would also be covered in stowage, so it makes sense to add it here. The 2 sets of tracks and road wheels come in 3 separate pieces, and you can glue them all together immediately if you want to, but to make painting a little bit easier I decided to make the tracks separately. So I used the road wheels as a brace to hold the tracks in place, and I applied glue to the ends of the tracks and let them dry. This then allowed me to separate everything for painting and also to be glued together later on. Then I began the painting. As I said, I'm not using an airbrush in this, and all it takes is a large brush and Vallejo's Russian green paint. I also didn't bother priming the model. You can do if you want to, but as I went on to paint 3 coats of paint, it doesn't really need a primer. I just ensured that the paint covers everything, and I got it right into all the nooks and crannies. So I leave it to dry before applying a second and then even a third coat. By then it will look pretty smooth and fine when you've finished. You could also speed this process up just by buying a can of Vallejo Russian green spray, but I am demonstrating how to paint this with just the kit that most people already have available. I also painted the turret and the road wheels at this stage in the same fashion. Then I turned to the tracks as the glue had dried, and I began painting them in Vallejo black. Again, this was using a big brush and just ensuring that all the little recesses were covered properly. As you can see here, the tracks have set solidly, and it makes working on them and the wheels so much easier this way. The next stage with the tracks was to apply Vallejo's oily steel. This was applied in a heavy dry brush fashion. Simply get some paint onto the brush, then wipe off as much as you can and brush over the tracks, ensuring you pick up the details of the track links. You can also have some black showing through here as well, this just gives the tracks a little bit of tonal variety. Then, to finally finish the tracks, I added Flurry Wash Rust. This is a clay wash that goes on quite bright, but once it dries it creates a nice rusty look colour with some texture to it. I then just set these to one side to dry as I'd finished with the tracks for now. Later on I used the exact same technique here to do the spare track and also the exhaust once I'd finished painting the hull. So once the hull, the turret and the wheels had dried, I began dry brushing them with Vallejo's Russian uniform. This is a lighter green than the base Russian green, and I used it to pick out the edges and highlights of the details across the model. The trick with dry brushing is to work gently and build it up, as it's easier to add paint here than it is to take it away. If you add too much, simply repaint the model in the base colour again and just start again. Russian tanks of the Second World War didn't really have a specific numbering doctrine, so you can go a bit mad with adding decals. The set comes with several different water slide decals, and I decided to number my tanks differently just to make them easier to use in games. You can also add the patriotic slogans that some tanks had written on them, but these were actually written in chalk and they generally didn't survive the travel to the front lines anyway. But they look cool, right? The decals are put in water and then simply put into place with a small brush. Then once they were dry I painted a small amount of matte varnish over just to hold them in place. I didn't film this though. The next thing to do was begin weathering the tanks, and for a very basic weathering look I used MIG Brown for dark green filter. This is an enamel wash which has very good capillary action, meaning it works its way into all the details on the kit. It also acts to bring all the colours together in a cohesive way. Once the filter had dried, I used some white spirits and a cotton bud to wipe away the filter from the larger areas and the raised bits of the vehicle. Doing it this way ensured that the filter remained in the recesses and created a shadow and a dirt effect that is quite nice and a simple weathering look. If you're going to go for speed, you could finish the models here at this stage and call them done, but I had a few more things that I wanted to do just yet. Chipping is a really effective way of showing that a tank has been through combat, and this is an incredibly easy effect to achieve. I used a ripped up sponge which I dipped into some German camo black brown. I then wiped off the paint and went over the edges of the tank, lightly stippling the paint on. I go over the edges of the hull and around the hatches and some other areas that would also see heavy weathering patterns. You can do as little or as much of this as you see fit. An older tank would have more chips, but a factory fresh one far less. This is entirely your choice about how much you do here. When the protective paint on the metal has chipped off, it doesn't take long for rust to form, so for this I use Flurry Wash Clay Rust. This is to emulate the rusty material that also occurs in rain. As before with the tracks, the wash goes on quite bright, but it does dry with a really nice tone and texture. I didn't go too mad with this, but just enough to give the tank a little bit of colour variation, and especially in areas where rust would form anyway due to heavy wear. Then, the penultimate weathering step was to create rain streaks using an AK Interactive weathering pencil. These are watercolour pencils that react to water. You simply dip the end of the pencil in clean water, then use it to draw lines across the top of the turret and the hull. Then using a wet brush, streak the material in a downwards motion as rain would naturally fall. You can then remove excess paint with a wet brush quite easily. Now the main weathering was finished, I moved on to the stowage and I painted it in various greens and browns. I wanted something different to the colour of the hull to add some interest to the model, but also to break up the monochrome look of the Soviet tanks. And use whatever colours you want here, as this stuff would have been picked up randomly by the crew anyway. Once the base coat of the stowage was dry, I then washed it all in Agrak's Earthshade from Citadel. This is a great wash that gets into all the recesses of the sculpted cloth, and it looks quite organic as well. Finally, to finish the stowage off, I lightly dry brush the base colour over the top, building up with slightly lighter layers one after the other, and then also painting in a few highlights with a much brighter colour than the base colour. Then, with that all dry, I finally glued the tracks onto the road wheels and I glued the whole track sections onto the lower hulls. Nicely, these models have ridges showing exactly where the tracks should go, and the fit is nice and snug. I had decided against making these tanks really muddy, and I preferred to make some tanks with dust rather than mud around the running gear and tracks. This was simply done by dry brushing German camo beige all around the tracks, wheels and the tide mark across the bottom of the hull. This is yet again another simple and very effective technique which will give you some tonal variation once again. Then finally, the last thing to do was to varnish the models. I didn't film this, but I did use a rattle can matte spray for this, and I ensured I did it outside. But that was it, a really quick and quite effective way of painting and weathering 3 veteran T34 tanks, ready to take on the armoured might of the Wehrmacht. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you have, please leave a like and a comment, and if you haven't already, please do subscribe, and I'll see you in the next Storm of Steel video.